Can you see what I'm sharing?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Okay, so let's begin. We have a short time to cover quite a bit of...
Sarah, I think you should put it in presentation mode.
That's a good point. How's this?
Yes, perfect.
Okay,
Thank you.
Now we're ready. We want to present for you today some considerations, frameworks, perspectives on how to manage social impacts, which is a specific kind of dimension to the liability discussion. And it's something that intersects, or we see it where we see the intersection between mining and society. It's a rather dynamic and complicated area to manage. So we will offer some insights on how to understand it and some tools to handle it and manage it. But it's you won't walk away from this talk being fully educated in how to attack this topic, but you'll have some insights at least on how to understand it and approach it further. As the presentation said, we are from Aalborg University, from the Danish Center of Environmental Assessment, both of us, Anne and I. And Anne has been working with social impact assessment. I don't know if you want to do your own presentation, Anne, but I can do it briefly. Specifically in regarding extractive industries in the Arctic, but also moving on to Northern Europe. And I come from a background of public participation and inclusion of civil society in planning decisions, and have moved into the mining arena, working with both the Arctic, but also Northern Europe. So we share some interest here, Anne and I, and have been working on several projects related to social impact assessment, specifically focusing on understanding the impact from mining technologies. So this is where we come from and who we are. And today we will cover 4 topics. The first one being, what is social impact? As a starter, to let you understand, we have a couple of key concepts that we will present to you today to understand what is it we mean when we're talking about social impact. I think we all have kind of an intuitive understanding of what it is, but we would like to kind of coin the term a bit more so you understand what we're talking about. Second topic is, why are social impacts so relevant to manage? Why are they important, and what is the potential damage if we don't manage it wisely and correctly? We have a couple of reasons for doing so. And the third topic is, what kind of social impacts are we talking about when we're talking about social impacts? And then the final one, when is it typically handled, and how can they be managed? There are several tools and approaches that can be used when you are trying to manage social impacts. So this is more or less the 4 topics that we will cover today. So Anne, I think you will take the first part.
I will. So first we're going to talk about what social impacts are and why they're important to assess. As it says here, a prerequisite for social sustainable mining management is knowing one's impact. And what is it then we talk about when we talk about social impacts? Please shift the slide, Sarah. Yes. So mining is known to lead to various impacts. It can lead to new jobs and investments in building and schools, like desired outcomes. It can also include the development of hospitals and other community facilities. But mining has also been known to sometimes involve undesirable impacts, such as displacement of communities, loss of land and livelihoods, and health hazards. During or in relation to mining, there are a lot of different interests at stake on different levels. On the global level, there is an interest to promote a green transition and access resources for different purposes for development of societies. But there's also this desire to mitigate climate change and to protect the environment on a global scale. On the regional level, we often see, especially the industries, calling for security of supply, that meets the demands of the industries in order to develop the technologies needed, but also in order to feed into the green transition that we are striving for. When we reach the local level, it's very much about being able to live the life, securing that an activity in the community or in the local area lead to a desired development that doesn't harm people or leave them worse off than before an activity took place, such as a mine. Whereas as on a company perspective, this about social impacts and what is desired in relation to social issues is more about gaining the license to operate. They have commercial interest in promoting an activity, and they're interested in what we call the social license to operate, the SLO, and acceptance from local communities in order to achieve a license and to achieve support and be able to collaborate with local communities. This is also why social impact assessment in many countries are mandatory. Sometimes it's required as a separate impact assessment that needs to be done in relation to achieving a license. Other times it's included in broader environmental impact assessments or integrated assessments. Sometimes it's not, or it's not always a requirement, a mandatory requirement in countries to conduct social impact assessments in order to achieve a license. But then we also see large investment banks such as the World Bank and the European Investment Bank actually making demands for and requiring that social impact assessments are carried out as a part of the application materials for financing these projects. So there are various reasons for looking into the social impacts from different perspectives, but definitely often just, or not just, but to promote a sustainable development in the areas where activities are implemented, and at the same time meeting the legal and national and financial requirements. So impact assessment is required, but what is it then when we talk about impacts that we're actually talking about? Could you shift the slide, please, Sarah? There is an organization called the International Association for Impact Assessment. And in the International Association for Impact Assessment, there are a particular group, both of combining researchers, practitioners, and people from organizations that has discussed this about what are the important topics to address in a social impact assessment. And most of the national legislations that we see in relation to social impact assessments lean upon the definition developed by the International Association for Impact Assessment. In their guidelines in relation to social impact assessment, they define social impacts as social consequences, both positive and negative, of planned interventions such as policies, programs, plans, and projects, and any social change process invoked by those interventions. So this means also the derived consequences of the activity. And they list these different topics that can be covered in a social impact assessment or screened in relation to addressing and identifying what kind of social impacts a project will have. And it's people's way of life. This is how they work and play and interact with one another on a day-to-day basis. It can also be impacts on their culture, shared beliefs, customs, values, language or dialect. It can be the community in a more broad sense, its cohesion and stability, its character and services and facilities, those that are accessible within the community prior to or during or after an activity. Then it's their political system. And this is about the extent to which people are able to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. It's also the level of democratization. This relates a little bit to what Sara is working a lot with in relation to participatory processes around activities, and social impact assessment are often addressing this about how, or not often, but is meant to address issues such as how does an activity influence people's access to these participatory processes that takes place beyond the project, and especially, of course, in relation to the project. It's also about the environment, the quality of the air and water people use, the availability and quality of the food they eat, It's the level of hazards and risks they're exposed to. It's about dust and noise, and the adequacy of sanitation in an area, the physical safety and their access to and control over resources. Then it's health and well-being. I think the word well-being is missing in this list, but it was supposed to be there. Where health is considered a state of physical and mental and social and spiritual well-being. So this means it also encompasses or covers issues that it goes beyond just not being sick, so to speak, the access of sickness. Then it's about personal property rights. Oh, are we still on the same slide? And particularly whether people are economically affected or experience personal disadvantage that can even include violation of civil liberties. And then it's their fears and aspirations and their perceptions about their safety. It can be fears about the future or anxieties about the future and the aspirations that they have. And it's important to say that all these impact categories, these that are addressed by the International Association for Impact Assessment, are supposed to be accessed both when in relation to positive and negative impacts, because and sometimes it can be there can be both positive and negative impacts even within the same category. But these are the overall categories that are the International Association for Impact Assessment recommend that are addressed in the social impact assessments. Yes, Sarah, thank you. And then I said this about, so from community perspective, it might be these social impacts that are important to address in order to achieve what they desire from a project, positive outcomes and mitigation of potential negative impacts. From a company perspective, there is an interest in gaining a social license to operate, both because it has shown, like experience has shown, that if there's no local backup to or support for projects, it can lead to conflicts and problems, both in relation to delaying activities, but also it can lead to a lack of interest in working as a workforce in the projects, and there can be obstacles in relation to the national legislation and legislators and governments that can also postpone or even stop projects. And the companies operate with this concept of the social license to operate, where they think if they get this kind of support, it can also benefit both the company and the local communities. And social license to operate is in the literature defined as the acceptance and approval granted by the local community to companies' operations. And it goes beyond legal compliance and encompasses the much broader social expectations and responsibilities of business. And in order to achieve such a social license to operate, research has shown across various cases that elements that are necessary for maintaining such a social license to operate is long-term relationship building between the actors in the field, meaning both governments, companies, potential NGOs or organizations, and local communities. Another element necessary for maintaining a social license to operate is collaborative partnerships, and then also meaningful community involvement in the decision-making processes, including the decision-making processes around the social impact assessment. Yes. Then Sara and I has been engaged in several research projects, as Sara also mentioned, and recently we've been engaged in a project that I'll also mention later, which Gracia was also part of, the ALSICAL project, and some of the things that we worked with there was definition of and inclusion of social thresholds. You probably know that in relation to environmental issues, environmental impacts, there are a number of like limitations to or values that sets the boundaries for how much you can expose nature to, how much many emissions or the degree of emissions that you are allowed to be causing. In relation to the social issues, social thresholds are not as easy always to address, and it can be challenging, and it's also often considered challenging. You could define social thresholds as, for example, technically or socially based standards that identify the point at which an indicator changes to an unacceptable condition. So when are social issues impacted to a degree where it's no longer acceptable, or when it should stop a project or require mitigation? So this means that significant and irreversible social impacts, which from an ethical perspective should lead to the decision of avoiding an activity in a specific area, because we talk project specific, are likely to be overlooked until later in the process. And at the point where these are overlooked, a company may have already invested in exploration activities, and because the social impact assessments are often not done until later in the process, so they may oversee them in these early stages of decision making. So a company may have invested in a lot of exploration already, even before applying for a production license, that triggers these social impact assessments. And then, therefore, we argued and have been looking into how can we work with social thresholds in relation to maybe early in decision making, identify what we call social no-go factors. And we published a paper on the topic where we identify, based on the human rights framework, different things that can actually be identified as what we call social no-go factors, factors that should stop a project. And the paper draws on the findings from the ALTICAL project that I mentioned before, which was on sustainability of the mineral and metal industry in relation to aluminium production. And we had the opportunity through this research project to engage with a lot of different stakeholders and actors, both companies and consultants and researchers, where we talked about what are the evaluation criteria when you decide to develop a greenfield or into a mining site. What are the things that the companies consider when they decide where to implement their next mining activity? And there are a number of different factors relating to the quality of geology, the accessibility by infrastructure, the national legislation, the feasibility, of course, to a large extent. And we then, there was this screening tool being developed, and we then identified a number of issues that could be identified as social no-go factors that could be built into that screening tool. And that was based on the talks that we have, but also together with the knowledge that we had from our former research. And if you go on to the next slide, please, Sarah. Some of the things that came out of the ALTICAL project was an identification of a number of general impacts that are often connected to mining projects and of significant importance. And then we also set up or identified a number of mitigation elements that connects with these different social factors. And some of these issues that stood out from our research was issues such as distribution of benefits, understood as what people get out of, like compensation or access to these new facilities or services that are provided. And we point at the awareness of existing inequalities as something to be aware of in this regard, and to the possibility of entering impact benefit agreements, which are required in some countries to be negotiated between the companies and the government and the local population to secure that benefits are achieved for the local communities that live with the cost of a project. So impact benefit agreement-like structures for locally accepted and fair benefit distribution, which again calls for a dialogue with the local communities in order to identify this. Another social factor is the displacement and other uses of the area. And this is about like mitigation elements that can be thought about in this regard are issues such as compensation to those that are displaced or excluded from access to particular areas. It can also be about opening areas for the same or other locally accepted activities, either when the activity is going on, but it can also be after the activity has ended if it's for a limited time that we talk about. Then there's the local context of use and ownership of rights and norms. And mitigation measures are such as being aware of existing laws and norms and adapting to those. It's about designing mining activities with the respect for these norms and communicate how or why not these are considered. Then it's the labor market. It's the use of local, like it's about so an important issue is the labor market and how workforce are attracted to work in the mine and how it affects the labor market in more general terms. For example, we often see that in relation to a mine, that a lot of people are attracted to get jobs in the mine, maybe from the local area, but then they come from other sectors, and maybe it can be harder then to get access to labor force from in other sectors as well. So this goes beyond the mine. Still, mitigation measures we point at is to use local labor when it's possible, but again, not to cannibalize on other sectors necessarily. It's about educating and training for scarce skills, and at the same time also supporting the diversification of the local economy, meaning that not only maybe attracting workers to work in relation to the mine, but also buying services, buying for example, food supply and so on in the local communities, so that the benefits go to the local, and so that the local economy beyond what is happening at the mine site is also supported and thereby strengthened. Then it's about another issue is this about influx of people to local communities, because we often see a lot of migration workers working in mine sites besides from the local workforce. And there it's again important to think about how to utilize the local workforce or consider the costs and benefits of maybe segregating workers from the community, so that the impact from the influx of people is not significant in a negative manner. And then there is an issue that is not actually what we found from the screenings or the reviews that we've done of existing reports, and also from like holding that up against the recommendation, is the topic of gender and intersectionality, which is which definitely has the opportunity or like the possibility of being better addressed in the impact assessment report. And which is again one of the issues that is actually standing out as issues of general and significant importance. And the things that can be considered in relation to gender and intersectionality is segregation or reducing the influx of workers, also relating to the above mentioned topic. And it's about including discriminated and weak groups in the planning processes and removing constraints for women to get access to mining jobs. And when we talk about constraints for women, it's not just about getting access to the job, but it's also designing the workplace in a manner where women are feeling welcomed, so that there are, for example, toilets, etc., for the different sexes, and clothes in the right size, also for women, and security issues that relate to women's strengths and weaknesses and so on. Yes. And then, Sara, I give it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Anne. I just needed to find my unmute. So now we've gone through a couple of the key elements, key concepts related to social impacts. The next part is related to why you should interest yourself towards this topic. Why do we need to consider the social impacts apart from the legal requirements? Of course, we do have the legal requirements. But first, I think we'll start a very central aspect of mining, which is the investment and the funding of mining activities. I think it's a very important part of every mining project, how it is funded. One element that could answer why it's important is investors, and to what extent the investors are driven by ESG. And when I say ESG, it's of course environmental, social, and governance factors. There was an investigation of what is it actually that's driving the allocation of capital in investment in mining. And I think it's very interesting to see that it is not social license to operate, which is at the bottom. You can see the black part of the black purple is investors rating it's very important, and the lighter purple is investors rating it important. But you do see, however, that 56% of the investors who's asked actually rated as either very important or important. So it is at the top of the list, sort of, at least at the bottom of the top. You see the top of the list as the most important criteria that's driving allocation of capital is the improvement of financial performance for a mining company, for example, or whether we have pursuit of innovation, diversification of locations, and potential environmental liabilities. And I imagine that you have been covering environmental liabilities as well in this course. But I think it's positive to see that the social license to operate as a kind of indicator for social impacts is also on the list. And also as actually to a significant extent. But this also means that the investors might not be the only driving force for managing social impacts and having an interest in social impacts and social license to operate as a mining company. So we do, of course, also have a couple of legal frameworks driving the interest and why we should interest ourselves in this. And it's very much driven not by the individual national state, but as intergovernmental and other organizations. This is an example of an Australian transparency instrument, which is called the York Code, and you might already know it. And that's a professional code of practice that has a minimum standards of what you should be reporting in relation to your exploration results. So as a point of departure, or when you first look at it, it has nothing to do with social impacts, but it has everything to do with transparency, and transparency in the way you act and your practices as a mining operator and exploring mining opportunities is very important to, for example, the political aspect of the social impact, so as not to make local communities feel excluded from the exploration phase. So just this fact that you are required in this Australian York Code to report on your results is an aspect that's kind of driving the interest in social, or at least in the political aspect of the social impact assessment. Another example is at EU level, where we have the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. And I think, I don't know whether you are familiar with this already. Maybe you have covered it in relation to the environmental liabilities aspect. But here we have both Strategic Environmental Impact Assessment Directive and also the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. What we see here is that the social impact assessment is often not included directly, but as an kind of a side element to it, because the understanding of impacts, environmental impact, is very broad in the EU directive, because we understand environmental impact also as humans and as health and as elements of community. So we do have elements incorporated in the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive that is kind of a part of the social impact assessment as well. What you see here in the figure is that we also have an element of public participation built in the screening and assessment process in the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. So when you start out by screening, is an EIA, SIA, SEA necessary? Either it's a project specific or it's a strategic impact assessment. And then you have a scoping where you identify what kind of issues is necessary to assess. And in this scoping process, you do have public participation as a required element. So people are allowed to have an influence on what is it actually that you investigate in these impact assessments. And then we have the assessment itself. And then we have another public hearing where we lay out the results from the report as ready for or to be commented on by the public. And often this hearing is a part of the decision-making process afterward as to whether we should have political in the political decision-making. So this is transparency tool is also a public participatory tool where we sometimes include social elements. We do, however, don't have a specific social impact assessment included, at least in the EU. But this is different when you enter into other areas of specifically Africa, which is, I think Anne covered this as well, where we have a lot of projects that is funded by the World Bank, for example. And the World Bank has not requirements for an EIA, an environmental impact assessment, but they have requirements for environmental and social impact assessment, so an ESIA. So here you have a further focus on social impacts in the requirements from the World Bank. So I think this is interesting because we see some, this is also an example of where we don't have national legal requirements to include social impacts, but we do have supranational legal requirements from, for example, the World Bank, from EU, from different organizations. So this is to a large extent driven by non-national actors. I would like to refer you to, as in the bottom of your screen here, you see Mononen et al. It's in the literature list after in the end of the slide as well. You can see an overview of the EU legislation, so you can dig further into that if you wish to do that. Yes. So when it comes to how the national states they regulate and govern the mining area in regards to social impact assessments, we see that in most countries they have a sovereignty over natural resources, so they can decide if and when and where. The ownership of the natural resources is in the hands of the state. I think this is quite intuitive, perhaps. So this also means that governments can decide no-go zones, for example. They can also decide no-go, total stop. But what we often see is that we have governments identifying this is where we want mining and this is where we don't want mining. And there's a social aspect to this because you can take social impacts into consideration in these decisions, and governments do so. So they consider where would it be socially sustainable to have mining and where wouldn't it be socially sustainable. And this, of course, is very depends on the national governments and their visions and the ways of doing things. But we in many countries, we see these no-go zones where we don't want extraction. So national states is that the decision-making has the decision-making power. So it's also the national states that has the power to decide to what extent we take social impacts into consideration when you decide where to extract and where not to extract. So this is kind of a paradox, or it's kind of interesting when you see that we don't have a lot of legislation on a national level when it comes to including social impacts in mining decisions, but it is the state and the government who has the final say in where we extract. So the search or the development towards including social considerations is driven by other actors who actually don't have the final say in these decisions. But in general, all or most mining nations require these impact assessments. So it's not that we don't have any considerations. We do have a lot of environmental considerations. And when it comes to social impact assessments, I think there's room for improvements, but it doesn't mean that we don't have anything at all. In many countries, we actually do have quite a substantial legislation related to the ESIA framework. Yes. And then of course, we see with the kind of a side element to the social impact, the public participation, it's very varied when it comes to how it's implemented and how it's a part of the decision-making process. I think it's difficult to say that we have one size fits all in any in any state or government, and not even across continents. I don't think we can find likely or similar processes here. It's very different from national state to national state. So the reason why I kind of keep bringing up the public participation element is that it's very tightly connected to the social impact assessment. In its essence, the social impact assessment is a kind of an engagement tool. And it is a way of having a dialogue, establishing a dialogue with a local community, but also on a nationwide scale. And the other way around, you cannot do a social impact assessment without going into dialogue with locals and national levels of communities. So it's interlinked, these public participation, engagement, and social impacts and impact assessments, which is why it keeps popping up. Yeah. So this is if you have to do any way of generalizing how it's regulated and governed across states and continents, then I think this is kind of the only statement that covers all. But of course, then there's a lot of difference as well. Okay, so this is regarding the legal frameworks, and not even legal, but also the way things are governed. But there are, of course, also other reasons why we should, mining players, mining companies should consider themselves with these social impact elements. And another one is in order to manage conflict, basically. I don't know if you know about the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice, but here you can pull out the ongoing conflicts at the moment related to mining projects. I did so in EU and in Southern or Latin America. And here you can see the conflicts that related to mining projects, and this is only mining projects. So this is a very good argument in order to of why you should look into the social license to operate and the social impact as a way of understanding or gaining the social license to operate. And I took a couple of quotes here from the descriptions of the ongoing conflicts, just to show you that we're not kind of messing around. We have the bottom one here says that police in Switzerland launched an operation to remove protesters who have been occupying a quarry owned by cement maker Lafarge Holcim. So we have people occupying quarries where operation stops, and when operation stops, you lose a lot of money. So that's one reason. And the one on the top is the conflict seriously escalated in April 2019 when a group of 40 people set fire to an exploration camp on the mine site. So here we have arson, and that's also quite serious. So you don't want that when you start out a mining operation, to have fire set to your mine site. And the last one says regional councils Department de Régional, this is in French, and city councils also publicly disapproved the project. And this is a part of a process and a conflict that's been ongoing, where you see that what started out as a public conflict and driven by local community, it kind of seeps into the political level as well. So you get the political layer against you, and then you don't get a mining approval if you don't have the political decision makers on your side. So it's not that you could ignore local communities and have them going into conflict and just keep moving, because it's also the political decision makers who are impacted by these conflicts. So this is also a very big why you should look into social impacts, because it's the driver, or it's the kind of the weapon against, or the solution to conflicts. And this is not to say that we can avoid conflict, because there will be conflict, and there will always be conflict. But I would say with some some certainty that if you don't consider social impacts or the social license to operate, then you're for sure will have a conflict that you have contributed to escalate. Yes. So these are the questions, or these are kind of the answers to why you should look into social impacts and why the social license to operate is so important. So the last question is, how is this actually practiced, and how do mining players, mining industry take this social impact assessment into consideration? And also at what time, at what point in the planning or in the planning of the project is it taken into consideration? And Anne kind of hinted that it's quite late in the process, at least in the planning process, but we have a little bit more to say about that. Yes. So first of all, I would introduce you to the ESG framework, and the ESG is kind of everywhere at the moment. It stands for Environmental, Social and Governance Framework, and it comes from, originally, it's coined by the UN Global Compact, but it started long before that. I think the first side of it is in the 1970s, where it started out as a social responsible investment concept, and then it kind of seeped through a lot of supranational organizations, and it's been living its life ever since. But now it's kind of materialized as the concept we're using now, which is the ESG framework. And what it is that it's a metric used to measure an organization's or company's environmental and social impact. And it's become increasingly important to investment decisions. So what I showed you before, where we see what is actually the important elements to allocation of investment, the ESG factors is definitely a huge player here. And for mining industry, it provides kind of a structured approach to reporting and to compliance. So it focuses on, for example, transparency and stakeholder trust and long-term value creation, but it also has the social element to it. So how do we handle and how do we take care of this social license to operate, and how do we understand and manage the social impacts? So the ESG framework, I would consider kind of an overall framework for kind of one of or many of the initiatives that we see that has been launched by different organizations. One of the initiatives and a way of managing social impact is through the impact benefit agreement. And the impact benefit agreements come originally from Canada, where it's a legally binding contract between community and the project developer. And here you see that the mining developers, they negotiate directly with local communities in order to figure out how can we share the benefits, how can we improve benefits, and where should it be, how should it be shared? So what do local communities want out of this? The goal is to share the benefits from a project as a means to kind of address the impact in local communities. In Greenland, it's a little bit different. Here you see that the impact benefit agreement is negotiated between mining companies and municipalities and also the Department of Minerals. And it's based on a sustainability assessment where you identify what would be problematic impacts and how should you address those in order to mitigate them. Typically, these Greenlandic impact benefit agreements, they focus on education and how do we monitor these and evaluate different mitigation plans, and also related to focused on how do we use Greenlandic subcontractors and how do we use Greenlandic workforce. So it's very much focused on how can we get something economic development out of this project and get it led into the Greenlandic society, whereas in the Canadian, we also see that local communities have negotiated extensive sum of money for each inhabitant of a local community, which they can use whichever way they want. So it's very different, but we can talk about a mitigation hierarchy I think the best thing is to avoid social impacts, but then you can also try to compensate impacts. And the impact benefit agreement is a way of compensating for social impacts that you would have from a mining project if you cannot avoid it, because sometimes you cannot avoid social impacts. Another framework is TSM, and you might be familiar with this. It's called Towards Sustainable Mining, and it is also a Canadian initiative. They are very much in the forefront in Canada when it comes to social impacts. And it has spread, to my knowledge, at least to Norway, and maybe further beyond. And Elizabeth May, which is a former Green Party leader who was a part of developing this TSM, she has this very nice quote saying that sustainable mining for many sounds like an oxymoron. You cannot make it sustainable, but there are ways to get it, and it starts with conversation. So this kind of leads back to my statement before that public participation is a very central part of addressing and mitigating social impacts. So, but of course there are many. This Towards Sustainable Mining is a Canadian initiative, and which is also now signed by the Norsk Bergindustri in 2020. But there are several others, and you might be most familiar with the ICMM mining principles, which is also very widespread between the members of the Council of Mining and Minerals. But we also have something from the World Gold Council, very much only focusing on gold mining. We have principles here for responsible gold mining, and related to copper mining, we have risk readiness assessment, which is something they use there in order to understand social impacts. So, and there are also more than I have mentioned here, but it is kind of the way that it's been handled, not by national states, but by different interest organizations, is through these protocols. And how do we manage? It's very much through protocols at the moment. I just wanted to show you with an example of these protocols. This is from the Towards Sustainable Mining, where you have different elements and also connected indicators. So it's very operational when it comes to how you manage social impacts. But here you see two dimensions of how you do sustainable mining. It has to do with community and people, and it has to do with environment and climate change. So there is a very social element to it, but there's also an environmental element to it. But as Anna showed, is that the environment is an integrated part of understanding social impact. So we have environmental impacts, but the environmental impact cannot be separated from the social impact that it will have on a community and also nationwide scale, because of course we are impacted by our environment. So this is also a part of the sustainability here. But if we talk only about the community and people, we have elements of indigenous communities and also community relationships. So we have specific attention towards indigenous people, and this is because a lot of the land that we mine, at least in the northern part of the Americas, is owned by indigenous, and this is also the case in Europe, some places. So there needs to be a special attention towards how to handle and understand the integration or use of indigenous lands. Then we have elements related to safe and healthy and respectful workplaces, which is also something Anne covered, saying that we do have gendered impacts related to how women can be a part of mining jobs. And this is also a critical, diverse, and inclusive workplace. So these are kind of connected. And then at the bottom, prevention of child and forced labor, which is specifically focused on a couple of countries and not kind of a world spread consideration. But these are one of the ones that Anna mentioned earlier with the no-go factors. So the child and forced labor is very much a no-go factor when you understand the social impacts of mining. So I think this is why it has special attention in the TSM protocol. Yes. So this is just an example, and I would urge you to look into the other examples that I've brought here as well. Yes. And Annie, I think over to you now.
Thank you. And time is flying.
Oh,
but just returning a little bit about to the question of when social impacts are managed. So Sara, will you shift the slide, please? So I mentioned before that social impacts are often not managed until the mandatory impact assessments that comes with the application for the exploration license. This means after with the exploitations license, meaning after the exploration phase. And Sara and I have been looking into, particularly in Greenland, how decisions are made in the companies that operate there prior to this phase, also to get an insight into whether social impacts are actually considered early on, even though it's not mandatory. And we find that that's often not the case. That this is also what comes out of the conversations that we have had with consultants and mining companies during activities, the research activities that we've been engaged in together with these. And it's not from because the mining companies don't want to, but they don't always know how to. And this is where it's important to guide them, and where the social impact assessment is a tool that has been adapted very much by the mining communities. But when it comes to maybe addressing social issues earlier on, they don't really always know how to grasp it. And if we look at the table to the right in this slide, there is a list of the different phases in a mining life cycle related to the decisions that are made by the companies. And you could say the first decision a company makes is what we call in the scoping phase, where they evaluate the greenfields for attractiveness according to the factors I also mentioned before that are chosen by the company. And this is where they decide whether or not to continue into the next phase, to the pre-feasibility phase. And then we have the early exploration or the screening phase, where pre-feasibility studies are made. The first exploration is always already feeding into thoughts and considerations by the companies about whether to move forward with development in a certain area. They make initial field surveys, and again, this is according to the factors chosen by the company. And since there are no legal requirements to engage in considerations regarding the social, as I said before, this is often not a part of the equation. After this phase, they decide whether or not to continue to the feasibility phase, where they hand in an application, decide to apply or not apply for an exclusive exploration license. Often the first exploration license is a non-exclusive one. An exclusive exploration license is a license, as you probably know, where there's only one company that has the right to explore in a certain area. Then there's the exploration phase, where feasibility studies are made, and where the company usually starts up the process of conducting a social impact assessment. This is where the impact benefit agreements are negotiated. Environmental impact assessment is often also a requirement. And again, it's according to the legislation and regulatory guidelines. And this leads to the decision about whether or not to move forward with an application or no application for a production license. And then we have the design phase, the construction phase, the operation phase, and the closure phase, and the post-closure. And you could say that the exploration phase is already early. However, when decisions are made in relation to whether to move forward in developing greenfields, a number of issues related to social impacts can already be identified, and also lead to considerations by the mining companies in relation to whether or not to take certain actions in order to gain a social license to operate. Sometimes, as I also mentioned earlier, a lot of investments are made in the early phases of decision making, in the scoping and screening phases by the companies. And this means that if no-go factors are identified when it comes to the exploration phase, during the exploration phase, before an application is made for a production license and the exploitation license, then it's quite late in the process that these issues are identified. And sometimes it's even already too late to do something about some of them. Just one example of one of the things that we talk about, a no-go factor. Sara mentioned childhood labor, but another thing is for example, a human right is access to clean water. So if a mining activity in a certain area will use the water resource in an area and thereby make it difficult to, or even impossible for the local communities to access the water resource, then you can already say that then things need to be done in order to avoid this, either to get the water from another place, to mitigate and plan the project in a manner so that this is taken into consideration, or by simply saying, okay, well, this is a no-go factor because we can't make the mine without access to the water resource, and this means violation of human rights, so it's we don't want to move into this area. So what we say is that despite the substantial social impacts that we know a project can have, and social thresholds typically go unidentified until after the exploration and feasibility studies have been conducted. And then you can turn to the next, Sara, please. Yes, so what we do suggest in relation to achieving a more sustainable or social sustainable mining practice is that, and this is to look at the phases prior to social impact assessment phases and encourage the companies to engage and screen for the social factors in these early stages of decision making. When the attractiveness of potential mine sites are screened, as I mentioned before, the typical factors that are taken into consideration by the companies is the field geology, it's the mining design, it's metallurgy, it's infrastructure, logistics, environment, and politics in an area. And all of these are considered to have no-go factors. Well, there are things, if the geology isn't, if the quality isn't good enough, then you don't go into the area. If the infrastructure is not present, or if it's too expensive to establish, then it can be a no-go factor. If there is a local corruption or obstacles in relation to gaining licenses, it can be a no-go factor. But the social factors, as we mentioned today, are not often taken into this consideration in these very early stages. And we claim from our research, based on our research and based on these conversations with the industry, that social factors should be considered in order to promote a more sustainable mining practice by identifying social thresholds in the given context in relation to the individual mining activity, and furthermore by including social no-go factors in these screening processes. And that was actually almost the end. There's one more slide, just saying that first of all, thank you for your attention, and we're looking forward to hear if you have any questions. And then just to mention that we are continuing to work with the screening tool to develop the screening tool, and we are presently engaged in a new research project funded by the European Union called the Resource Project, and you are welcome to visit the webpage of the project. And again, we focus on, it's a big project that covers a lot of different aspects, and our team is working particularly on social impacts related to extraction of minerals in Norway. And it focuses on developing eco-friendly technologies to minimize environmental and social impacts. It's working with technologies known also as invisible mining. It's in order to improve waste management through a circular economy approach and promote responsible mining practices in general. And it also seeks to enhance the social engagement and collaborative activities with other projects to drive widespread adoption for global raw material standards. So we very much like to engage with various stakeholders, also the companies, in order to be wiser and understand what and how the companies, in a manner that makes sense, can work towards a more sustainable practice when it comes to social sustainability. Thank you. And then, Sara, I think you have a list of references if there are somebody who would like to read more about the topic. And these are some of the things that, some of the documents that we can recommend, and a couple of them are our own, but since it represents the latest research in the field, I think it's relevant to share them with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne and Sara, for your interesting presentation. I asked to people connected if they have any question, you can share on the chat, or maybe you can hand your hand. We can open the micro to you. Okay, I think there is not any question. We will share the presentation in our website. Thank you for you to attend, and for you, Anne and Sara, of course, to be here. We will be in contact in Resource Project too. And well, this is the last session of the workshop, so thank you very much to all of you to be here these days. We are very proud to organize this kind of workshop to show what are we doing in mining sector. So only remember that if you want to get the certificate, you will have to answer the test we will share by email. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning to all of you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.